So hi, my name is Keith Gelhorn. I'm the founder and chief empowerment officer of ADDvocacy. And what we do is we coach neurodivergent youth and adults who live with ADHD, learning disabilities, autism, anxiety, and any co-occurring mental health challenge that impacts executive functioning. Our clients are typically students in high school. And then we've got a post-secondary transition program. We also coach post-secondary students. As of August 1st, we have 100% funding for all our post-secondary students that we coach. So if you are in Nova Scotia, that's all through student loans. If you're in another part of the country, it does vary between 50 to 100%. Best to contact us for information on how that works. We also coach adults who are struggling in their careers and or entrepreneurs. And a couple recent announcements as of late. One of the things we started doing recently is we're collaborating with the Adult ADHD Center, which is based out of Burnaby, British Columbia. They have nurse practitioners basically stationed right across Canada, and they can offer ADHD diagnosis via telehealth for $300. And they've got about a 6 to 8 week turnaround. So that's one organization we're working with. And then as of this week, or not this week, last Monday, there's another organization runs somewhat similarly called Beyond ADHD. And they're based out in New Brunswick, but they also have nurse practitioners that are able to practice both in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Similar model. However, they also address kids who have ADHD, so 6 and up. So they go 6 to 17 post-secondary students and adults. So as of Friday, we're going to be live on their website, and we'll be handling a lot of the coaching for them. So up until this point, I've usually handled adults, but we've had so many requests for the youth and kids and parents, and I have a whack of coaches who are chomping at the bit to tackle that area. So we're going to open up to that. So it'll be like full service right throughout the age range, which is how I like it because it doesn't just go away. So today we have Dr. Wayne MacLeod. He's a local doctor here in Halifax who practices family medicine, I believe. You're my girlfriend's doctor, which is kind of a funny thing, and also has this keen interest in doing the disability tax credit, and we're all excited to hear all about that and what you have to say. So introduce yourself and tell us about yourself.
Well, hello, folks. As Keith said, I'm Dr. Wayne MacLeod. I'm a family doctor with an office in Bedford, and I've been in practice about 20 years. And I had an interest in the disability tax credit, which was a relatively new government program when I was in residency. And when it came out, it was it was and it still is a terrific program. But it's a program that suffers from a lack of education and awareness, a lot like ADD and ADHD actually. It's a tremendous program that once a person is qualified into the program, there's some considerable financial benefits that come from it, and it's also connected and linked to other sorts of things, like particularly in education. So for instance, if you have a student going into university or trade school that has ADD or has been approved for the disability tax credit, it makes it a lot easier for that person to get accommodations with their schooling. So it's been around for a long time. I've always had sort of an interest in it because it was relatively new when I was in residency, and then over the course of the pandemic, I had because of the way medicine was being done in the early parts of the pandemic, I had a little free time on my hands, and had this thought about here in Nova Scotia, there's 100 to 120,000 people who don't have a family doctor, and this particular government program requires a healthcare professional or a family doctor to complete the application for the applicant. And so I got thinking to myself, well, how do the people here in Nova Scotia who don't have a family doctor, how do they get this application filled out? So I consulted with my college of Physicians and Surgeons, and I consulted with CRA, consulted with my medical malpractice insurance to ask what if I were to hang out my shingle and offer this to people who weren't my doctor, if I could establish a history of whatever illness might qualify for this credit, would I be allowed to help people who aren't my own patients officially? Could I help them do this credit? And turned out I was allowed to, and so I started kind of doing evenings and weekends doing the disability tax credit for people, regardless of what the disability was. And over the course of doing that, I've done several hundred applications anyway. I'm lucky enough to have some expertise in it now, and I have a fairly good track record of success. But more importantly, I've been able to establish sort of what it is CRA is looking for when you're looking to get an application approved. So I've got a bit of a process that kind of helps people along. So some of you may be familiar with the credit, but if you're not, it's a federal credit that comes from the federal government. It's essentially a break on a person's taxes. So the government recognizes that persons who have disabilities have increased costs associated with their disability that a non-disabled person has, and as a result, they will offer some financial respite, essentially. So if you have so you get a break on the taxes that you owe. If you've had an illness or a condition that's lasted for several years, then you can actually get a retroactive kind of refund for those taxes. So that's one of the great things about the tax credit, is that you actually, if you've had an illness that has been that for which you could have been qualified for a number of years, you can get a refund on taxes that you've owed. Or a refund on taxes that you paid. The big benefit of the disability tax credit, though, is that it's linked to a financial product called a registered disability savings plan, which is essentially an RRSP, or a retirement fund that a person can pay into, and the government will also will also match your contributions to. So it's another quite lucrative thing for people to apply to once their credit has been approved. The disability tax credit covers illnesses that affects both physical and mental illnesses. It doesn't have any kind of exclusions. The disability has to be prolonged, and it has to be severe. So they define prolonged as anything that has lasted or is going to last longer than a year, and no illness is excluded. So a person with ADD or with ADHD, if they have it in a sufficiently severe degree, then they should be able to get credit for this. All that needs to be done is the application has to be signed by someone who understands what it is that Revenue Canada is looking for in order to get the application successfully fulfilled.
Can you tell us, a lot of us, especially people who self-identify as ADHD or have mental health challenges, have tried to apply for this thing, been denied multiple times. And why now? Why is it coming to the forefront now that some of these challenges are becoming more recognized?
Well, so this disability tax credit, when it first started out, it came from a previous program, an older program that really only represented illnesses that caused physical disability. So the same program, for many years, the federal government would sponsor or contribute to persons who had amputations or were blind. If they were legally blind, or if they were confined to a wheelchair. So there was a federal pot of money that was assigned to help people with that. And over the course of time, it was really the finance minister at the time was Mr. Flaherty. Mr. Flaherty had a child. I think the child had Down syndrome. And so he's had sort of a, necessity can be the mother of invention. He kind of expanded that pool of funds to persons with mental and physical disabilities. And this tax credit program went through a number of changes over the past number of years. The most recent changes, just in the last couple, where they've recognized mental illnesses in a much more specific way. So compared to the old applications, the new application form really kind of shows where ADHD fits on the application. There's specific sort of criteria and specific sorts of deficits that are actually recognized that apply to ADHD and ADD. So previous applications were denied for a number of reasons. A lot of times doctors didn't put the right information in. Doctors like to go from symptom, diagnosis, and treatment. And anything that varies from that, we're not really good at putting in writing. So we'll put, a lot of application would say, Mr. Gelhorn has ADHD. I proved it by having this and this and this done. And this is his medication. But it didn't explain how the person met the criteria. So unless you kind of really spell it out for the person reviewing it, who's usually a layperson, how the person meets the criteria, then a lot of applications would be denied. And that would be true for a lot of the mental illnesses. Unfortunately, the mental function section tends to face a higher degree in order to meet the criteria than the physical ones. With the physical ones, it's a little more cut and dry. A person is missing a leg or missing their arm. There's no fudging that. But if the person has a mental illness, there's degrees of severity, there's ways of describing it. You have to be very, very succinct but clear how the person's deficits meet the criteria. So a lot of times we don't talk about the very basic, and sometimes you think it's going to be really complicated, but it's actually really simple. Like when you have to say, this person's memory is so bad that everything has to be repeated 3 to 5 times for them to get it. Or, to get my child dressed in the morning, it's like trying to tie up an alligator. You have to really kind of point out how the person differs from someone who is neurotypical. And so we're out. A lot of times doctors are at fault for not putting the right information in, and patients and clients sometimes don't really make it clear to their doctor how their illness affects them. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, not wanting to be stigmatized, kind of being shy about it. When you're in the doctor's office, there's always that, well, I've got 10 minutes and I got to get out of here. There's some of these things take a little bit more time to be thorough about. And at the pace that we're all trying to set, sometimes a lot of those things get missed.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts on all these pop-up disability tax credit writing services that take 30%? Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts. One of my motivations for getting into this line of work was a patient of mine who brought me forms that they had received from one of these companies. Mm-hmm. And I felt quite sheepish that I hadn't identified that this person should have qualified. And we got looking at it, and we went through it, and they send a bit of information, let you know what's going to happen, but they don't send all the information. So they don't tell you, they say, well, we're only going to charge 30% of this credit. We're only going to take 30% of the value of the credit, or sometimes it's 40 or 25. Between 25 and 40 is what I've seen commonly. But if you don't really know how much money the credit is worth, you don't really know what you're leaving on the table. So that was one of my criticisms. The credit is worth, depending on how much money you pay in taxes, it can be worth somewhere between $5,000 and $8,000 a year in refund. So if you have an illness that you haven't claimed for several years, that can be a lot of money. And then to give that up to a company who's going to help you write these things, I think it's a little disingenuous. Not only that, most of these companies still require your doctor to fill out the form. So they kind of go to bat for you a little bit, but they harass the doctor to do the form, and some of the companies will send the form pre-filled out, saying you just signed this form for your patient.
Yeah.
But it may not match what the patient really has, or it may not meet what the patient has. And these companies, unfortunately, although there is a need for them for some people who don't have a doctor or don't have anybody else to advocate for them, in a lot of cases, these companies are doing more harm than good, because doctors have gotten kind of a bad feeling about the disability tax credit, because these companies kind of hound them to get these forms done. So they've kind of done more harm than good. So that's now, again, recognizing that if a person doesn't have another option, in that way, it is at least some help.
Yeah, they kind of prey on people, I feel. And what I know about the disability tax credit is really the only thing that you can personally fill out is the first page, which is basically your information, and then the rest has to go through a doctor. So yeah, forking over 30% of a big chunk is not desirable.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sure there's yeah, how can someone use these companies if they don't have a family doctor? I'm going to open it up actually for live questions if people do want to ask, and I'm sure Tough Monkey, you'll be all over asking questions. Mark's been very active in our other groups, so it's good. But yeah, he's asking, how can some of these how can someone use these companies if they don't have a family doctor?
So some of those with some of those companies, they are no help to you at all. I don't. They do have some of the companies do have a doctor kind of on staff, and so they may be able to use that particular person. I don't know which companies are which though. But years ago, when these companies first came out, they hired a bunch of doctors to just kind of be quite mercenary about it. And one of the things that happened in the background were doctors were rubber stamping these applications without having any knowledge of the applicant at all. And then they got in a lot of trouble for that. Obviously, they're essentially committing fraud. And so we get another way, another reason why historically doctors have looked poorly on the application, because years ago they heard that CRA gave doctors a hard time for filling it out.
Mm-hmm.
So some of those companies really can't be of much help. And really, ideally, you're going to be able to get someone who's going to sign it, who is going to have the background information. So in my process, what I'll do is I'll need the applicant to send me information, medical records or psychology records or some proof that proof that their illness is present and how long it's been there. Because one of the things Revenue Canada will do is ask the doctor who has signed the application. Sometimes they'll send a follow-up questionnaire asking for more specific information, and other times they'll send a letter saying, well, send us the records that you reviewed to make sure that this person was qualified. So in my process, I always get that information ahead of time, so I can just send that right to CRA if we need to.
Okay, so Jerry's asking, I had my doctor refuse to even look at it, not my family doctor. I don't have one. So as you mentioned, it is a huge chunk of the population. We're talking 10 to 12% of the population don't have a family doctor, so they're relying on walk-ins or whatever they can get. What would prevent a doctor from wanting to fill this out in terms of time frame? How, like, yeah, there's a whole bunch. I'm sure there's a bunch of factors, but
there are a bunch of factors. In my opinion only, my opinions are just my own. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the tax credit. So there's still a lot of doctors that feel that you have to be blind or have to be in a wheelchair in order to get this credit, and anybody that's not identifiably disabled to that severity doesn't qualify, which is incorrect. So there's a lot of misinformation among doctors about what qualifies and what doesn't. If a doctor has had some experience sending applications and they get denied because they're not putting the right information in, and then they get the idea, well, it's impossible to get qualified for this thing, nobody ever qualifies, that also causes some that kind of trouble as well. So I think there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of lack of experience getting success with it. that makes doctors kind of shy away from it. I mean, no, none of us actually like doing paperwork. Really, we all hate it. We like to see
All
patients.
those.
We like to see patients and go home.
Yeah.
But I get into this because the credit is just so important, and it can really make make a substantial difference in people's lives to get it. So it is worth kind of the pain of doing the paperwork. And
Absolutely.
once
Well,
you've gotten the hang of it, it really doesn't take all that long.
yeah. One of the things I always say is paperwork's like kryptonite to Superman for us with ADHD. It's the last thing on earth we even want to look at or think about or whatever. And especially back in the day when we spend all the time, we get all the paperwork together, we mail it out, and then come right back with a bunch of revisions. And then you're sheepishly trying to go back to your doctor and nobody wants to look at it. So big question is how severe, or how do you measure severity of ADHD? Because knowing recent research, it's known that those of us who have had it our whole lives. How do you measure that? And
Well, it's a great question. So with all of the criteria, how Revenue Canada defines severity is so compared to somebody who's unimpaired, does it take that person 3 times as long to get X done in any given situation? So and it works so much more black and white in the physical impairment. So a person who has a severe walking impairment takes 3 times as long to walk a given distance as someone who isn't impaired. So that's pretty easy to measure. Harder to measure with mental functions, but doable. So when you say a person needs to have something repeated to them 5 to 7 times in order to make it stick, when you can demonstrate that the impairment causes social deficit, when it causes occupational deficit, when it causes emotional deficit, then that's getting into the severity. I think that for adults, one of the things that we forget to put on these things is the isolation that a person feels when they come across as being self-absorbed because they can't retain information. When they appear, this person lost several jobs because they didn't appear to be paying attention to what they were doing, or they were lost in thought, or this person has a history of procrastinating on important things, so they've missed deadlines that are really important, and those kinds of things. Saying those, writing those things to indicate the severity of how the illness impacts them day to day.
Gotcha. Yeah, one of the things that even though I coach around it, right? I have to pay out of pocket for I got a therapist, I got a coach, personal coach, and a business coach, and I spend about $1,000 a month on that. My family all think I'm bananas for doing it, but it keeps me stable, right? So I go up and down like a roller coaster, just like anybody else. Even though I coach around it, I still experience these feelings, right? And my dad is a capitalist type of person, thinks it's asinine. I'm spending 12 grand a year on it to keep me mellow. But is that something, or signs like that? Expenses that we incur.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
one of the criteria in the mental functions is, does the person have a severe memory impairment? So
Right.
when you say this person has to have things repeated to them 3 and 5 times in order to make it stick, they rely on notes and their telephone and their calendar in order to remember day-to-day things. They have to be reminded every day to take their medication.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. Those things highlight the severity of the illness. If the person has a history of interpersonal difficulties because they can't adjust to a person's body language or their nonverbal communication. Those kinds of deficits. Those are things that they need to hear. Right?
Gotcha. So there's a bunch of people asking about how they can see you, obviously, and I'm sure your waiting list must be massive. What is the process to connect with you? Do you just do this for your patients, or you do it for people outside? How does that work?
I'm lucky enough to be able to do it for people outside. So I usually start with an email. I get them to contact me by email, and I discuss sort of my fee for doing it and the process for doing it, and the information I'm going to require, and we'll swap the information back and forth. So I'll normally have somebody email me a copy of the records that we can use to, in case Revenue Canada is looking for them, and that way I don't have to harass them down the road looking for them, right? Because that's timed. You only get a certain amount of time to do that. So we start with an email, and I'll review the records, and if I think the records are gonna go their way with an application, then I'll do the application up and send and email it to them, and email it back. People who live in Nova Scotia, I can do it in person. I can set up a date and time to meet in my office, and we can do it in my office, and I can just bang it out there on that visit and send them home with it as long as I have the records.
So the people who do already have a diagnosis, does that make it easier for you? So if they have a psych ed assessment, or does it matter? Do you have to have a diagnosis? How does it work?
You don't need to have a diagnosis. So a diagnosis. So one of the great things about the disability tax credit is a diagnosis isn't necessary as long as there is proof of the deficits. So a person undergoing testing, as long as there's records that they've identified the deficits and that's under investigation, that's absolutely fine. So it's having the history of the deficits that's most important.
Okay. And how you explain it, of course, too. We work a lot with post-secondary students who go in with a psych ed assessment, the final page, and they'll walk in and say, I want all the stuff on here, right, for my accommodations. And I would imagine that, and we do a lot of stuff with grants, I would imagine that you have to say, I need this because of that, and this because of that. You have to be very black and white as to how you label it. Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah,
okay.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I think this answered that question. So Mark asked, what about someone like me who's been diagnosed late in life? So I think Mark's probably, I don't even want to guess, probably 40. I'm going to say 40 to be nice. Is someone like that able to receive a refund on the taxes paid? And if so, for how long?
So the tax credit can be retroactive up to 10 years ago.
Okay.
So if Mark is 40 and he was diagnosed in his 20s, we can get him kind of credit for 30 up till now.
Okay.
So it can be retroactive up to 10 years. You don't need to have had the diagnosis for 10 years, but the symptom severity has to be documentable for 10 years.
How does that work, Dr. MacLeod? Like, do you need to have had, like, I've only, like I said, found out about a year and a half ago. And while I have a family doctor who unfortunately I'm going to be losing very soon because they're moving on, but from like I only just recently learned about even what all of this is recently, I guess a year and a half ago. So prior to that, like I didn't know. I have had sorry, one sec. Started getting a bit choked up as you're talking about some of this stuff, and how it's impacted my life. And I didn't even know what it was. I always knew I was different in some way, but never really understood what that meant. So I guess what I'm getting at is I didn't know what I didn't know. So I didn't reach out to my doctor for help with some things. Like there were definitely some comorbidities that were associated with it as well. So, I mean, that's likely, there's records, I guess, of that, but, only until recently did I reach out to my doctor for other, supports and that sort of thing, and people like Keith and, that type of thing. So I guess that's why I'm wondering about the retroactive aspect of things where I don't know what might be considered records, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I know, and it is definitely a real problem. And also, there's also the problem of wait times for evaluation and getting in to get tested and getting a diagnosis can take a year and a half sometimes. And so you kind of lose that time. But if you have records that, so let's say you were either incorrectly diagnosed or given labels of depression or anxiety because of other problems that happened in the past.
Yeah.
You might those records might be able to help with that. So having the label or the diagnosis doesn't matter so much as if you can demonstrate there were problems beforehand, right?
Okay.
So,
But is that only through a doctor? Like, what other ways is there to demonstrate that there was issues beforehand, aside from personal stories?
Yeah, apart from the medical record, I really don't know, Mark. I have to be honest. I don't know that there would be a way of going back any further than what's in the record, right? I mean, you could suggest it. We know no harm to suggest it, but they're pretty firm on, as far as the tax credit thing is concerned. You'll be more likely to get a eligibility for the last year and a half or 2 years maybe, then that goes forward for you 10 years or something like that. So you often get credit. The credit often is given to you for a period of time. So lots of people will get retroactive for easy things like osteoarthritis or things like that you can prove was there for years. But oftentimes what you'll get is, from 2018 to 2028, you'll be covered for it. And so you'll be able to claim the credit on your taxes going forward instead of going backwards. So there wouldn't be refund, but there would be eligibility for going forward.
Okay.
One of the things sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. One of the things that I've seen with a lot of us who have this, and I've been fortunate that I actually enjoy my job, but by the time I was 25, I had like 50 different jobs. Clear indicator that there's challenge, right? Have you ever seen that come about too, where you're looking at, just to kind of echo on what Mark was saying? Have you ever seen, the circumstances, either, the amount of jobs that people have had, the frequency of which they're changing, the mental health stuff that goes along with it? Have you ever seen anything like that come about as well?
So yes and no. So unfortunately, the story, in retrospect, you can tell a great story.
Yeah.
But that won't necessarily satisfy CRA in terms of documentation and proof. But if during the course of that, during that period of time, if you had been seeing if you happen to have had to have seen a psychologist because behavioral trouble at work or personality conflicts at work and those kinds of things, if there were psychological records or visits with a psychologist going back at that time, that might be able to be used as proof. But I've never seen, like, for instance, I've not seen them be able to use like an HR record or anything like that.
Oh, okay.
That would be great if you could, but I've never seen that be something that they use as the basis for proof.
Okay, so Mitchell asks, he's got multiple diagnoses, so IBS, type 2 diabetes, ADHD, and depression. Is having more than one diagnosis more helpful in getting approved?
Yeah, again, yes and no. Not really. Regrettably, if you have more than one area of impairment, you don't get additional credits. It's just one. It's either a yes no kind of thing. You get approved or you don't get approved. So a person with IBS might get approved on the basis of the difficulties with bowel and bladder function that have nothing to do with the mental state associated with IBS. But if they have frequent bouts of diarrhea or those kinds of things, you could be qualified for that. So the more medically ill you are, the more likely you have something that qualifies. Right. But you're not necessarily going to get more credit for having more illnesses.
So Jerry was asking, I'm just trying to make sense of this question. He says, I have nephews with a diagnosis, but I'm the only adult in my family that has figured out that my issue is ADD. Mental illness is kind of taboo in New Brunswick. So Jerry, just to clarify, have you been diagnosed or you haven't been diagnosed? I'm not quite sure what he's asking there. Okay. he has been diagnosed. I don't know. I'm not sure how to convey that question. Oh, but none of his cousins or siblings have. If it's around a diagnosis thing, I mean, you can. Do you deal with the diagnosis side of things with ADHD, or how do you handle that in Nova Scotia?
Only with my own patients.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, only with my own patients. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, no, I wouldn't presume to make a diagnosis on somebody that I was meeting just over the internet or,
Oh, of course, yeah.
or for these purposes. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
wouldn't do that.
No, fair enough. All right. Just seeing if there's any other questions. One person was asking about, if I think we might have answered this, could report cards or family responses on a psych ed assessment, could any of those influence it or not so much?
Well, the psychoeducational ones could be used for sure.
Okay.
The report cards, probably not so much. I mean, that's a great question. I've never used a report card as proof of a person's ADHD outside of my own clinic, right?
Of course.
So I don't know about that. I think that it would have to come, the psychoeducational assessments for sure, use those in lots of cases, but not the report cards.
I think I'd asked you this before about our DSP, and actually tomorrow, when I initially saw you do your thing here, you were doing some stuff with Independent Living Nova Scotia as part of their series. And actually tomorrow they are doing a thing on our DSPs, just a fluke. I did post all their information on my Eventbrite page. But do you have any comments on the RDSP and how this kind of, you got to get the one to get the other? Like,
the disability tax credit application is like your gateway into getting a registered disability savings plan. Once you get that qualified, you can go either to the bank or to someone who is a financial planner, and they can help you set that up. It's should look into this yourself. I believe it's up to age 49 that a person can contribute to one. So if you have a child, with a diagnosis, you can make contributions to it up until their age 49, and then they can take that money out. So it's kind of like an RRSP. But better than an RRSP, because the government will contribute to it. Will match your contributions. But yeah, so I don't know a whole other than that's what it is. I don't know much about it. I don't get into that myself. Other than I try to remember to tell everybody who I get qualified for it that they should go now and see if they can get an RDSP set up, because it's a great financial product.
I know there's a fee to do it, and I know doctors typically only get 10 minutes to have an appointment, ish. Is that part of the big reason? Because one, they don't know how to do it necessarily properly, and then they do it, comes back because there's something wrong, and then they're expected to do it again and again, and they just can't be bothered. Is that kind of
I think that's at least part of it. I think there's unfortunately a lot of bias about what constitutes a disability and what doesn't, and so if the doctor isn't open to considering the possibility that the person might qualify, then they won't get it.
Right.
I mean, just in a general sense, all doctors hate paperwork. All doctors hate doing anything with Revenue Canada, because we all hate them with a passion. So just having to do anything with them at all just gets your ire up anyway. But I think it's mostly the bias about what constitutes a disability and what doesn't. And sometimes I think it's got to do with opening the floodgates. If I do one application for a person with depression, then I got to do it for everybody in the practice with depression, and I'll never get out of the paperwork. Or, so if you've already got your limits on what you think qualifies, then you cut down the number of applications you have to do. So I think there's a bit of a self-preservation aspect to it too. It's privately paid for. I don't know about the other provinces. In Nova Scotia, the government won't pay you to do the application form, so you have to charge the patient for it. And maybe there's a bit of guilt about taking money for doing those forms. I don't know, but in my mind, it's certainly something that the benefit to the credit is worth going through the hardship of doing the application, because it really can be life changing for people.
I was going to mention one thing on the doctor side of things. I actually coach a lot of doctors myself and pre-med students as well. That's kind of a niche I've fallen into. A lot of people, I'm actually coaching one right now, as a matter of fact, and everything's going great except the paperwork, right? She's getting none of her reports done, right? That's the feedback they're getting. But yeah, it's definitely just like we experienced neurodivergence and the challenges that come along with it.
Right. Well, who wants to do paperwork when you can be on Zoom having some fun, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no.
Do they identify as someone who's neurodivergent? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
The physicians that you coach?
Yeah. Tons with ADHD. Have coached some on the spectrum.
Cool.
There's tons of them. One of the coaches one of the people I coached was and she was a neurosurgeon in Toronto. And I don't know about you, Dr. MacLeod, but she was doing that. She had a kid who had cancer. She had 5 different research projects she was working on. She was teaching. She was like, and I was like, the problem is you got too many things going on. And it was funny. One day I said, what you need to do is just, go for a walk. You got a nice path behind your head. Go for a walk. And she came back, she said, that was the best advice anybody gave, because she's too busy to do anything else, right? It's just it's just silly, but something to think about.
And one of the, and I certainly don't mean to tell you guys things you already know about your illness, but there are a lot of physicians who have ADHD, because the creative, energetic side, get into a bunch of projects, have lots of energy. That's the cool side of things, right?
Yep.
But what people don't see is that hyper focus that immerses you into some project that you can work on for hours, but then you forgot your family was there and you didn't eat supper and they didn't see you all weekend, or you can't relate to anybody who isn't interested in your area of expertise anymore. And so the interpersonal difficulties that come from with the loneliness and the isolation that happens, that's the downside to being that involved in so many of those things. Somebody mentioned here, besides the family doc, who can fill out the disability tax credit form, which is a great question. Depending on the type of disability, so for instance, if there's a disability involves vision, then an optometrist can do it. If the disability involves hearing, an audiologist can fill out the form. A family doctor can do all of the deficits. A physiotherapist can do walking, the walking area. An occupational therapist can do the walking and the dressing. And in the mental function section, a nurse practitioner, family doctor, or a psychologist can do the form. So if any of you are seeing a psychologist, they can also sign off on the disability tax credit form.
I wanted to ask, because I'm curious, I guess partly because I'm going to be losing my family doctor very soon, and I would actually like to reach out to you and work with you to help go through the forms and that sort of thing. And I realize that might require some communication with my doctor, which is why I'd like to do it sooner than later. I'm just wondering, do you have to wait for your tax time to submit for this credit, or can you submit it at any time?
You can submit it any time at all. Yeah.
Okay.
There are a lot of them that get done around April when tax time comes, and then another big bump of them often around Christmas time when there's business year ends or something. But yeah, no, it can go in at any time.
Okay, that's really great to know. Thank you.
So I feel really, really honored that you did take the time. The feedback we're getting is phenomenal. So I really appreciate it, Dr. MacLeod. And I'm sure everybody does here as well. Sure, you're going to get an inbox full of emails here. But yeah, is there any other words or anything you'd like to share?
No, I don't think so. I hope I answered most of the questions, or at least give you some place to start. Anyway,
Yep.
I wrote in here that the tax credit form is called the T2201, and it's on the Government of Canada website. And anybody that comes to me, I've got it kind of preloaded on a computer, so it's no problem. You don't have to bring anything in if you're coming to see me in person. And like I say, we can chat by email if you'd like to talk about getting this thing done up for you. And you guys give me a shout, and we'll take it from there. And if you guys want to do this again sometime, if there's other people coming in that want to hear about it, I'd love to join again.
Dr. MacLeod, thank you so much for taking the time, and it's amazing to actually meet you in person, and you're just as nice a person as I thought you were going to be, and I'm sure everybody would agree with that. So really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Take care.